For analysis now, let's get straight to political reporter KCAL9's Dave Bryan. And some surprises tonight, Dave.
There were, things aren't always the way they appear in politics. I know you already know that, but, we're joined now by Ange-Marie Hancock, Associate Professor of Political Science and Gender Studies at the University of Southern California. Let's start with the Democrats this time. 7-4, Hillary Clinton won 7, Bernie Sanders won 4. But in terms of expectations of what was going to happen tonight, who was the winner, who was the loser?
I think, there was really a tie, and I'll explain what I mean by that. In terms of a tie, I think Clinton absolutely met expectations. So she absolutely won. She won strong in the South, and she was able to really demonstrate that South Carolina was not just kind of a one-off kind of thing. She also won Texas, which is a much more kind of ethnically diverse state among the southern states that were up for grabs tonight. And so she really did well. On the other hand, I think Sanders also met expectations because people have been talking about the passion of his supporters. And those passionate supporters hadn't necessarily shown up in that caucus element in the way that we were expecting them to. But tonight they did in both Minnesota and in Colorado, where the caucuses really went for Bernie Sanders.
Now, 6 of the 7 states that Clinton won were, as you say, in the South. And most of the states have very powerful African-American voters on the Democratic side. Does she have to prove, do you think, that she can win? Because South Carolina was the same, right? Do you think she still has to prove she can win in other states, or do you think she did that tonight?
Well, I think her winning, even though it was a very close race in Massachusetts, started to make that case. I think the real kind of question is going to come in the Southwest, though. Those states where there are significant proportions of Latino voters, in particular, are going to be that real kind of, can she go beyond just African-American voters that are kind of always those standard Democratic voters?
Now, Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, won 3 of the 4 states that weren't in the South tonight. Does this, I think a lot of people thought of Bernie Sanders, oh, what a nice guy. Look, he won New Hampshire, the neighboring states. He won Vermont. Oh, isn't that cute? But now he's won Minnesota, he's won Colorado, he's won states outside of his region, large states with diverse populations. Does this establish him as a national candidate more than before?
I think it does. I think particularly Colorado. Colorado is usually called right now a purple state. It's not exactly a red state. It's not exactly a blue state. And so the whole kind of narrative that the Clinton campaign has been using, that Clinton is electable and Sanders is not, that kind of got shaken a little bit tonight. And given the money that Sanders has raised, if he can mount the kind of ground game that's necessary, he could end up dragging out this primary season.
Now the Republicans, Marco Rubio. Finally, he won something. What does that mean for him, and what does it mean for the campaign on a larger scale among the Republicans?
Well, I know to the degree the Rubio campaign is getting any sleep these days, they are definitely going to sleep better having won an actual state. I think what's interesting about Rubio's victory and even some of the other victories that have happened tonight is that those late-breaking voters have started to break for Rubio and for Cruz. And so maybe those attacks are actually starting to work that Rubio started launching.
Now, Donald Trump still obviously won the large majority of the states. I think the others won a total of 3, really, between them, Cruz and Rubio. So for Donald Trump, I want to first, let's take a look at something that Trump said about his perception of this campaign and of himself.
I am a truth teller, and I will tell the truth, okay? I am a unifier. I would love to see the Republican Party and everybody get together and unify. And when we unify, there's nobody that's going to beat us.
What you think the impact may or may not have been of the controversy over David Duke and the KKK, did it hurt Trump tonight, even though he still won, most of the states? And did it have some effect on Rubio as well?
Well, I think those comments about unifying are really looking ahead. So the comments about the KKK, most of these primaries and caucuses were in the South. And so that idea of disavowing David Duke, you know, people kind of think of that as politics as usual, but also with kind of a wink and a nod, right? Knowing that, you know, the dog whistle politics, that the certain folks who need to hear that that might be an okay thing to vote for Trump was heard. And we saw some of that in some of these southern states.
Kind of opening the door with a wink and a nod, like
Exactly,
you said. Yeah.
exactly, opening the door. And so the idea then for Rubio and Cruz is, okay, how do we kind of stop that and counteract that? And I think the question is still open as to whether or not either of them can. They want to hang in long enough. Rubio wants to stay, you know, until his home state of Florida on March 15th. But again, March 16th, I'm not really sure what's going to happen.
But if they both stay in, is it essentially a death sentence to both of them individually because they're splitting up the anti-Trump vote and in a sense allowing Trump to continue to win?
Well, I think those two staying in and also Kasich holding on, he did do very well in Massachusetts, for example. I think both of those kinds of decisions that these three candidates are making are going to really make it hard. And so when Trump talks about unifying, he hasn't even unified the people in opposition to him.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a real kind of challenge about unifying the Republicans before the general.
It's a real chess game, huh? Yeah. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.